The wind screamed across the endless Russian plains, carrying with it the dust of war. From a distance, the sound of engines and marching boots rolled like thunder, growing louder with every heartbeat. Thousands of soldiers in gray uniforms, their helmets glinting under a pale sun, marched eastward under the shadow of the Iron Cross. Summer was dying, and with it, so was peace. The year was 1942, and Hitler's war machine had found its next target, a city named after his greatest enemy, Stalingrad. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler stood before a massive map that covered the wall of his office. Red arrows cut through Europe like claws, all pointing toward the Soviet Union. His finger stopped at a bend in the Volga River. Stalingrad, he whispered, his voice cold and steady. A city that bears Stalin's name. When we take it, the world will know that even the gods of communism can bleed. Around him, generals exchanged nervous glances, but no one dared to speak. The Führer had decided, and his will was law. Far away, in the heart of the German Sixth Army, Lieutenant Karl Weber adjusted his helmet and stared at the horizon. He was 26, tall, fair-haired, and tired beyond his years. Dust clung to his uniform, and the smell of fuel and sweat filled the air. The men around him joked and sang marching songs, but their voices were hollow, more habit than hope. Karl opened his small notebook and wrote, **, they say the Volga will be ours soon. The Russians are breaking. Once Stalingrad falls, this war will end. **, he didn't know why, but even as he wrote those words, they felt like lies. On the other side of that horizon, the city of Stalingrad woke to another morning of fear. Smoke already rose from the factories along the river. Ivan Petrov, a young machinist who had turned soldier only a week ago, stood beside his mother outside their small apartment. The distant hum of planes vibrated through the sky. "Mama, you must go to the east," he urged. "The Germans are coming." But his mother, her face streaked with soot and strength, shook her head. "This is our home," she said quietly. "If they want it, they'll have to bury us under it." Ivan didn't argue. He kissed her hand and went to join his unit near the Volga. He would fight for her, for the city, for the soil beneath his boots. That evening, the sky turned black. The first German bombers appeared like metal vultures, and within moments, Stalingrad exploded. The Luftwaffe dropped over 1,000 tons of fire upon the city. Buildings collapsed like toys, streets split open, and rivers of flame ran through neighborhoods. Ivan's world became noise, glass, smoke, and screams. In one corner of the burning city, a church collapsed under the weight of a bomb, in another, a hospital turned to ashes. And yet, the people fought. Men grabbed rifles, women carried water, children dug trenches. Karl's unit arrived 2 days later. The streets were still smoldering, and the air smelled of death. "This is hell," whispered one of his soldiers. Karl didn't answer. He saw an old woman's body on the side of the road, her hand still clutching a small Soviet flag. The ruins whispered defiance. Each street, each shattered wall seemed to say, "You may destroy us, but you will not pass." The German advance was brutal and relentless. They fought for every block, every building. By day, tanks roared through the rubble; by night, snipers hunted in silence. Karl quickly learned that no house in Stalingrad was ever empty. There was always someone waiting, a soldier, a civilian, sometimes even a child. He lost 5 men in one afternoon clearing a single factory. When darkness fell, they took shelter in a bakery that smelled faintly of burnt bread. One young private, his face pale with fear, asked, "Sir, do they even feel pain?" They fight like shadows. Karl looked out through the broken window at the burning skyline. They feel pain, he said quietly. That's why they fight so hard. For Ivan, the days blurred into nights of endless fire. The Red Army's orders were simple, not one step back. The Volga River was behind them, and beyond that, nothing but open land. Retreat meant death, so they stood and fought. Ivan's mother joined a group of women who tended to the wounded in basements. Once, when Ivan visited her between battles, she smiled through the dust. "You see," she said. "We're still here." He tried to smile back but couldn't. Her hands were trembling, and he could smell the smoke in her hair. By mid-September, the Germans claimed half the city, but Stalingrad refused to surrender. Hitler demanded daily updates from his generals, shouting through his radio, "I want that city. I want the Soviet flag torn down." His pride had turned the battle into obsession. For him, Stalingrad was not just a military target, it was a personal vendetta. But for his soldiers, it had become a nightmare. The fighting was street by street, room by room, sometimes even floor by floor of the same building. One floor held Germans, the next Soviets, and both sides could hear each other breathe. Autumn came, and with it, the first cold winds. The once busy river froze at the edges, and the nights grew long. Karl could feel the fatigue in his bones. He wrote another note in his diary, "The Russians will not break. We are bleeding for a name, a word on a map. Maybe it is not the city that is cursed, but us." He tucked the notebook into his jacket and went back to his men. Meanwhile, Soviet reinforcements crossed the Volga at night under the cover of smoke. The boats were small, fragile, and often destroyed before reaching shore. Ivan was among those who crossed one freezing night. Artillery shells screamed overhead, and the black water splashed around them. His friend Nikolai whispered, "If we make it, we'll fight like devils." Ivan nodded. "If we don't," he said, "the Volga will remember our names." They made it barely. On the far bank, they found the city waiting, still burning, still alive. By late October, Stalingrad was a corpse that refused to die. Entire districts had vanished, yet the Red Army clung to the riverbank like a heartbeat refusing to stop. Each explosion carved new wounds into the land, but the spirit of the people only grew stronger. Inside one of the last surviving factories, Ivan crouched behind a steel beam, rifle in hand. He could hear German voices in the next room. Smoke filled his lungs. He whispered to himself, "They think we are finished. Let them come closer." That night, as snow began to fall over the ruined city, Karl stood among the rubble, staring at the frozen river. The stars above were cold and distant. "We've conquered the city," he murmured to himself, "but not the people." He didn't know it yet, but far to the north, Soviet generals were already preparing a counterattack that would trap the entire German Sixth Army inside this dying city. The hunters were about to become the hunted. Ivan looked up at the sky and saw the same stars. He felt the snow melt on his cheek and whispered, "For Stalingrad. For Mama." Around him, the ruins echoed with silent courage. The city was broken, but its heart still beat faintly, stubbornly, endlessly. The wind howled again, sweeping through the ashes, carrying whispers of what was to come, not victory, not yet, but the beginning of the storm that would change the war forever. The city of rubble. The first snow fell quietly over the ruins of Stalingrad, soft white flakes settling over the blackened bones of a city that no longer looked alive. But beneath that silence, the earth still trembled, not with life, but with the heartbeat of defiance. Smoke rose from hollowed buildings, mingling with the snowflakes, turning them gray before they reached the ground. Stalingrad was not a city anymore. It was a graveyard that refused to die. Lieutenant Karl Weber wiped frost from his rifle and stared across the shattered street. The war had stripped him of everything. His uniform was torn, his boots stiff with mud, his hands numb. He could see shapes moving in the mist, not soldiers, not exactly. Shadows, ghosts of men who no longer believed in anything except survival. His commander had once told him, when you control the Volga, you control Russia. But now, after weeks of fighting, the Volga felt like a distant dream. The Germans had taken streets, squares, and factories, yet the city never truly belonged to them. Across the river, Ivan Petrov crouched inside the skeleton of a bombed-out apartment, his rifle pressed against his shoulder. He hadn't slept in 2 days. The city reeked of burnt metal and frozen blood. Somewhere beneath the rubble, his mother's clinic had once stood. He didn't know if she was alive. He couldn't afford to wonder. The only thing that mattered now was holding the line. His commander's voice echoed through the icy air, "For every inch they take it back with fire." The battle was no longer fought in open fields. It was fought room by room, floor by floor, in the ruins of homes where families had once lived. The Germans would take a house in the morning, the Russians would retake it by night. Walls riddled with bullet holes became new borders of life and death. Even the dead could not be buried. They lay where they fell, frozen into the ground, eyes wide open toward a sky that had forgotten mercy. Karl and his men fought their way through the wreckage of a tractor factory, a monstrous place of twisted steel and broken glass. The noise inside was deafening, gunfire echoing off metal, grenades clattering under machinery. Every step forward cost a man. When it was over, he found himself standing among the wreckage, his unit reduced to half. The silence that followed was worse than the fighting. Somewhere in the distance, a woman was singing faint, haunting, a lullaby carried by the wind. Karl turned toward the sound but saw nothing but smoke. For the first time, he felt something close to fear, not of death, but of the city itself. Stalingrad had become alive and it hated them. On the Soviet side, Ivan's unit had been ordered to defend the very same factory. They arrived at dusk, stepping over bodies frozen in grotesque poses. The air was heavy with the smell of oil and gunpowder. As they settled into position, a shell exploded nearby, showering them with shards of glass. "Keep your heads down," Ivan shouted. But his voice barely carried over the roar of machine guns. A bullet grazed his shoulder, tearing through his coat. He didn't flinch. There was no space left for pain. That night, the temperature dropped below zero. Men huddled around small fires that gave no warmth. Karl wrote in his notebook, his handwriting shaking, "They say victory is near, but the map in Berlin does not smell like this place. It does not bleed, or freeze, or scream. We have won nothing." He looked at his men, boys really, their faces hollow, eyes glazed. They had come to conquer a name, now they were dying for it. Meanwhile, Ivan shared a crust of frozen bread with Nikolai. They ate in silence, listening to the distant rumble of tanks. "Do you ever wonder why we fight?" Nikolai asked quietly. Ivan stared at the flickering flame. "Because if we stop, they'll burn everything. My mother, your home, all of it. We fight because we must." His words were steady, but his hands trembled. At dawn, the Germans attacked again. Waves of gray uniforms surged through the ruins, bayonets gleaming. The Soviets waited until they were close, then opened fire. Bullets cracked the morning air, and the street became a storm of chaos. Karl ran forward, shouting orders, but the world was a blur of smoke and screams. A grenade exploded nearby, and when he opened his eyes, the ground was red with snow. He crawled behind a fallen wall, his ears ringing. Through the dust, he saw a young Russian soldier rise from the rubble, rifle aimed. Their eyes met for a brief, silent second. The boy couldn't have been older than 18. Karl hesitated, then lowered his weapon, but the boy fired first. The bullet missed, splintering the wall beside him. By the time Karl looked up, the boy was gone. Later that evening, as darkness swallowed the city, both armies stopped shooting. Not out of mercy but exhaustion. Somewhere in the ruins, a gramophone played a broken tune, the needle stuck on the same note. It echoed eerily through the cold air. Ivan sat beside a broken window, staring at the river. He thought of his mother again, of her hands, her laughter. He wanted to believe she was still alive, maybe tending to the wounded in some basement. He whispered her name into the night, but the only answer was the whisper of the wind. In the German camp, Karl received new orders. They were to push to the river at dawn, no matter the cost. He read the message twice, then folded it and tucked it into his coat. No matter the cost, he repeated under his breath. The phrase felt like a curse. He looked around at his men, frostbitten, hungry, hollow, and wondered how much more there was left to give. As December arrived, the city froze completely. The Volga turned to ice, and even the smoke from fires drifted sluggishly through the still air. Stalingrad was silent except for the distant thud of artillery. Both sides had dug into the ruins, like wolves in a graveyard. The Germans controlled most of the city, but not the riverbank, and as long as the Red Army held the river, the heart of Stalingrad still beat. One night, while scouting the perimeter, Karl stumbled upon a fallen Soviet soldier lying half buried in snow. The boy's eyes were open, staring at the stars. Karl knelt beside him and noticed something strange. The soldier's hand clutched a small, hand-stitched flag of the Soviet Union. The edges were burnt, but the red was still visible. Karl hesitated, then gently closed the boy's eyes. "You fought well," he whispered. "Better than any of us." Across the river, Ivan lit a small candle for the dead. Its light flickered weakly against the wind, but he shielded it with his hand, refusing to let it die. "They will not take us," he said quietly. "Not while we breathe." The city, broken and frozen, seemed to listen. The flames in its heart still burned beneath the ash. The Germans thought they had conquered it. But Stalingrad was waiting, cold, wounded, silent for its moment to strike back. The winter trap. The wind over Stalingrad had changed. It no longer carried the smell of fire, it carried ice. The Volga River, once a restless artery of black water, had frozen solid. The snow now lay thick on the ground, muffling the sound of boots and gunfire. The war hadn't stopped, it had simply gone quiet, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Lieutenant Karl Weber trudged through the ruins, his breath white against the bitter air. His uniform hung loose on him now, his cheeks sunken, his hands cracked from cold. The once proud Sixth Army was barely recognizable, hungry, frostbitten men huddled in ruins, waiting for orders that no longer made sense. They had reached the Volga, but they couldn't hold it. The Russians still poured across the ice at night, ghosts moving through the darkness. Each day, new rumors spread, whispers of encirclement, of Soviet armies closing in from the north and south. Karl tried to ignore them, but even the officers spoke in hushed tones now. The radio messages from headquarters had grown erratic, full of desperate reassurances. Asterisk, hold your positions. Reinforcements are coming. Asterisk, but the sky remained empty. Across the frozen river, Ivan Petrov was barely recognizable too. His uniform was patched with pieces of canvas, his gloves mismatched, his face hardened by exhaustion. He no longer felt hunger, only a burning determination that came from somewhere deeper than the body. He and his comrades had been waiting for this moment for months. The Germans had stretched themselves too thin, and now, the Soviets were ready to strike. The plan was simple: surround them, crush them, and let the winter finish what bullets could not. On the morning of November 19, 1942, the snow began to fall heavier than ever. The sky was a flat, endless gray, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. Ivan crouched with his unit in the trench, the freezing wind cutting into their faces. "For the motherland," the commander shouted. The words were barely audible, lost in the storm, but they were enough. The artillery opened fire, shaking the ground. The counterattack Operation Uranus had begun. To the Germans, it came like thunder from all directions. Tanks rolled out of the white fog, their red stars glowing faintly beneath the frost. Soviet infantry followed, shouting through the snow, their bayonets flashing in the dim light. Karl and his men were caught completely off guard. "They're coming from behind us," someone screamed. For a moment, no one understood. The Soviets were supposed to be in front of them, not at their rear. Within hours, the scale of the disaster became clear. Entire German divisions were being cut off, their lines collapsing under the weight of the Soviet assault. Communication broke down. Radios went silent. Karl climbed to the top of a ruined building and looked toward the horizon. To the north, columns of smoke rose like black pillars. To the south, he saw flashes of artillery. Between them lay Stalingrad, trapped like an insect in a web. That night, snow fell relentlessly. The city was buried under white silence, broken only by the distant rumble of tanks. Inside a shattered warehouse, Karl gathered his men around a small fire made of broken wood and paper. "When are we leaving, sir?" one asked. Karl stared into the flames. "We're not," he said finally. "The orders are to stay." The words hung heavy in the air. No one spoke after that. On the Soviet side, Ivan's unit pushed forward through the storm. The snow burned their faces, but they didn't stop. They could hear the German engines trying to escape, the desperate sound of retreat. Every few hours, they found abandoned vehicles and frozen corpses. "They're starving," said Nikolai as he kicked a can of spoiled meat lying in the snow. "Good," Ivan replied, his voice flat. "Let the winter eat them." By early December, the trap had fully closed. 300,000 German soldiers were encircled inside Stalingrad. Hitler's voice crackled over the radio, furious and delusional. Paulus will hold the city. The Sixth Army will not retreat. In Berlin, it was still a matter of pride. In Stalingrad, it was survival. Karl stopped writing in his notebook. His pencil had broken, and there was no point anymore. The men around him were starving. They boiled snow for water, scraped frost from windows, tore insulation from walls to wrap around their feet. The dead froze where they fell, their faces turned blue, their weapons still clutched in stiff hands. One soldier muttered prayers every night before sleep, though no one knew who he prayed to anymore. The Soviets watched the enemy decay slowly. Ivan had never imagined pity could exist on a battlefield, but sometimes, when he looked across the frozen river and saw the distant shapes of Germans moving weakly through the ruins, he felt something strange: not forgiveness, not mercy, just the quiet realization that war had made all men the same. One evening, Ivan was ordered to deliver supplies to a forward post near the city center. The journey was treacherous, snow waist deep, the wind howling through broken walls. As he moved through the ruins, he saw flashes of life: a group of civilians huddled around a fire, a child clutching a rag doll, soldiers singing softly in the dark. The city was still breathing, even as it bled. Meanwhile, Karl's commander received a radio message: the Luftwaffe would airlift food and ammunition to the trapped soldiers. Everyone waited for planes that never came. Those that did were few, dropping crates that often fell into Soviet hands. "We are being left to die," one officer whispered. Karl said nothing. He knew it was true. By mid-December, the temperature had dropped to -30. The snow glittered under the moonlight like glass. Inside the ruins, men huddled together, sharing what little warmth they had. Karl walked among the wounded, handing out the last pieces of bread. One soldier, barely conscious, caught his sleeve. "Will we go home, sir?" he asked weakly. Karl hesitated, then lied. "Yes." Ivan and his comrades launched their final push to tighten the noose around the trapped army. They fought through the night, house to house, bayonet to bayonet, until the Germans were forced into a shrinking circle near the city's center. Every shot echoed off the walls like the city itself was crying out. When the battle ended that morning, Ivan stood over the frozen bodies of the enemy. He was shaking, but not from cold. He looked at Nikolai and said, "It's almost over." Nikolai didn't answer. He was staring blankly ahead, a thin trickle of blood on his cheek. Days later, Karl awoke to silence. No shells, no gunfire, just the whisper of the wind. He climbed out of the shelter and saw what was left of Stalingrad: white snow, black smoke, and the distant glimmer of the Soviet banners rising again. He dropped his rifle. His hands trembled. For the first time since the war began, he allowed himself to feel the weight of it all: the futility, the madness, the sheer waste. The trap was complete. The proud Sixth Army, once the spearhead of the Reich, was now a frozen monument to hubris. Ivan stood by the river that night, staring at the faint northern lights shimmering above the ruins. "It's ending," he whispered to himself. The words didn't feel real. Stalingrad had devoured everything: men, machines, dreams, and still it stood. The Volga's frozen surface reflected the stars like a sheet of broken glass. Somewhere beneath that ice lay the bones of soldiers from both sides, indistinguishable now, their struggles swallowed by history. The winter had done what no army could. It had closed its fist around Stalingrad, and the world would never be the same again. The surrender and the silence. The first light of February crept over Stalingrad like a ghost. The sun rose pale and cold, revealing a city that was no longer a city at all, just a vast grave of ice and ash. Smoke drifted lazily over the ruins, curling upward like the last breath of something that had finally died. The guns had stopped. The shouting was gone. For the first time in months, Stalingrad was quiet. Lieutenant Karl Weber stood inside the ruins of a schoolhouse, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his eyes hollow. Around him, the few remaining soldiers of the Sixth Army sat motionless, wrapped in torn blankets and despair. Their faces were gray, their eyes vacant. Some stared at the floor, some at the sky. None spoke. Hunger had taken their strength, frost had taken their hope. The radio had gone silent 2 days earlier. The last message they had received from Berlin was brief and senseless: *hold fast. Reinforcements will come. But there were no reinforcements left. The Soviet lines surrounded them completely. Every road, every sky, every escape had vanished beneath the iron curtain of snow. Karl stepped outside. The air was sharp enough to slice skin. All around him lay what once had been the center of the German advance, now just piles of frozen steel and shattered men. He looked toward the distant river, where Soviet banners fluttered faintly in the wind. They were still coming, slow and steady, methodical, like time itself. Far across the battlefield, Ivan Petrov trudged through the same ruins, his rifle hanging loosely at his side. His uniform was torn, his boots soaked through, but his eyes burned with a fierce calm. The fighting was over, but the horror was not. The ground was covered with bodies, German, Russian, civilian, all frozen into the snow, their faces caught mid-expression, some in pain, some in peace. He had seen death before, but never like this. It felt endless, uncountable, beyond reason. As he walked, he saw a German helmet half buried in the snow. Beneath it, a soldier's hand still clutched a notebook. Ivan hesitated, then bent down and pulled it free. The pages were stiff with frost, the handwriting barely legible. He flipped through and read a line, *, "We have conquered everything, yet we have nothing." *, he didn't know whose hand had written it, but the words lingered in his mind like an echo from the other side of the war. At the German headquarters, General Friedrich Paulus sat hunched over a small desk, staring at a blank map. His face was pale, his uniform filthy, his eyes sunken from sleeplessness. The room around him smelled of kerosene and despair. Outside, the sounds of surrender were beginning, engines shutting down, weapons clattering to the ground, soldiers weeping quietly. A junior officer entered and saluted weakly. "Sir, the Soviets are at the door." Paulus didn't move. "They want our surrender," the young man added. Still no answer. After a long silence, Paulus spoke, his voice hollow. "Hitler made me a field marshal yesterday," he murmured. "No German field marshal has ever been captured alive." He looked at the officer, his lips trembling slightly. "But I will not die for his madness." At that same hour, in Berlin, Hitler raged inside his bunker, his voice echoing down marble halls that had grown cold and empty. He screamed at his generals, tore maps from the walls, and hurled them across the room. "Paulus is a coward," he shouted. "He will die, or he is nothing." But even his fury couldn't hide the truth: Stalingrad was gone. The myth of the invincible Reich had died in the snow. Back in the ruins, the Soviet soldiers advanced cautiously through the silence. There were no more gunshots, no more resistance, only the crackle of burning wood and the soft crunch of snow beneath boots. Ivan's unit moved through what had once been the city center. They saw the remains of tanks frozen mid-battle, horses lying beside their fallen riders, and walls covered in soot and bullet holes. The air smelled faintly of smoke and death. As they reached the schoolhouse, a group of gaunt German soldiers stumbled out, their hands raised. Karl was among them. His coat was torn, his lips blue, but his back was straight. He stepped forward and dropped his rifle into the snow. For a moment, no one moved. The Russian officer nodded slowly and gestured toward a truck waiting nearby. No words were exchanged. There was nothing left to say. Ivan watched from a distance as the prisoners were gathered. He didn't recognize Karl, but when their eyes met briefly, something passed between them: not hatred, not victory, but recognition. They were both survivors of the same storm. Different flags, same scars. The silence between them was heavier than any gunfire. Days later, the last pockets of German resistance collapsed. The Soviet flag was raised over the ruins. Stalingrad had been defended at a cost too heavy for any song or monument to carry. Over 2 million lives had been consumed by the battle. But from that ruin, something unbroken emerged, a sense that even in the darkest hour, defiance could outlive destruction. Ivan returned to what was left of his home. The building was gone, reduced to a skeleton of walls and twisted iron. He searched through the rubble until he found a small metal cross, the one his mother used to wear around her neck. He sank to his knees, holding it tightly in his fist. For a long time, he didn't move. Snow began to fall again, gently covering his shoulders, the ruins, the cross, the dead. In another part of the city, Karl sat inside a Soviet transport truck with dozens of other prisoners. The engine rumbled softly as it moved toward the east, toward the camps. He stared out of the small window at the passing ruins. Somewhere, a faint melody drifted on the wind, a woman's voice singing a lullaby. For a moment, it reminded him of home. He closed his eyes and whispered, "It's over." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure if he believed it. As night fell over Stalingrad, the stars emerged above the broken skyline. The Volga, still frozen, glowed faintly under the moonlight. The city was silent, but not dead. Beneath the snow, the heartbeat that had refused to stop still pulsed softly, buried under layers of ash and memory. Ivan looked toward the horizon, where smoke still rose against the stars. "We lived," he said quietly. "That will have to be enough." Far away, in a cold transport truck, Karl opened his eyes again. For the first time in months, he saw the sky wide, endless, untouched. Somewhere between defeat and survival, something within him stirred, not hope exactly, but a faint understanding.